three core pillars in the work that I do and the way that I carry out things. The three core pillars are really, to keep it simple, make it practical and engage everybody.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process. Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers. And in each of these episodes, I have the privilege of sitting down with process practitioners that are working in small, medium, large organizations. Sometimes it's consultants, sometimes from the academic world, and sometimes people that are working internally at organizations, managing and focusing on process optimization, transformation, process governance, really essentially taking the processes, the tasks and activities that we do on a day-to-day basis and try to improve them in any way, shape or form. And in today's episode, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Paul Deane, who is a senior business improvement lead, has worked at quite a wide range of organizations in terms of size. And so very excited for this conversation. I know Paul does a lot of education himself. He's got a YouTube channel that has quite a number of followers there and has lots of people that are engaged with his LinkedIn posts as well, which I'm an absolute fan of. So, Paul, thanks for sitting down with me and having this conversation with me today.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. Much appreciated to sit down and have a chat.
So the first question that everyone is eager to understand and to give a bit of context for the rest of the conversation is how did you find yourself in this world of process management? Was it something that you were formally trained in? Is it something that you kind of stumbled across in one of your former sort of roles? Tell us about that.
So Daniel, up until about 15 or maybe 18 years ago in my career, I was involved in manufacturing, so either in roles like, plant manager, operations manager, GM, ops, those kind of roles. So I always knew that there was formal ways to make more improvements and improve the way that we do things. So, obviously being in some responsible roles, the buck falls down to me. So, what I've always tried to do over the years is try and find ways to engage people, to collaborate with people, particularly team members, to try and make improvements. And it wasn't really until I think, 15 and 18 years ago where I started to do something a bit more formally. So that one of the organisations I worked for was very interested in globally doing some formal training and putting, which is a fairly common model, to put people in their facilities that are actually have some, training and qualification. So that's where I embarked about 18 years ago, where I embarked on the Six Sigma journey. Mm-hmm. Although, a lot of my experience has really been with, business process management or lean, over the years. So that's where I started. So I've kind of sat on both sides of the fence. So I do really appreciate what a lot of plant managers, ops managers, and people in leadership positions are going through in terms of trying to manage the processes.
Yeah, okay. And talk to us about what BPM is to you, because I know that for many people out there, it means many different things, depending on where their focus is in their current role. For some people, it's a very technical thing. Business process management for someone could be really hyper-focused on the process modeling side of things. For others, business process management is more about linking it to the strategic objectives of the organization. For others, it's about process ownership, process governance. For you, what is BPM? And you've also already mentioned Lean Six Sigma there. How does that tie into the whole piece? I guess just so the audience has a common understanding of where you're coming from in regards to that.
Yeah, sure. So I'm really passionate about three core pillars in the work that I do and the way that I carry out things. The three core pillars are really, to keep it simple, make it practical and engage everybody. So I really think that sometimes we overcomplicate things. So where I'm really passionate about, business process management is really in the fundamental part of the process. That I don't think anyone would be isolated from, the core processes that we work through. If you look at, from my original training in Six Sigma, Six Sigma is really about trying to drive out the variation, because variation leads to cost issues. And variation really comes down to the process. So I'm really passionate about making sure that people understand the process, they're trained to the process, and they follow the process. And if there's any variation, to try and find the root cause of why the process doesn't work. So, once again, keep it simple, make it practical, and engage everybody. If we find sometimes we get a little bit over academic about certain things, but I think if we focus on the simplicity of what we're supposed to do and target on it, I think it will really make a difference.
Great. And then talking about variation, I think that's an interesting one to sort of dive into, because I know I don't think anyone would disagree. I think people, would say that yes, in whatever process there are many sort of variations. I think sometimes we're unaware of how many variations. I think I'm aware of many different sort of case studies and examples out there where different techniques have been adopted to identify the variations, and the results of it is almost mind-blowing to be like, oh my goodness, like whether it's for internal customers like your employees or external customers, it's like, oh my goodness, is that what we're forcing them to sort of do? So talk to us about variations. Where do they come from when relating to business processes? Is it generally the really sort of old aged businesses that have a lot of Band-Aid fixes on their processes, that certain areas of the business have evolved over time, but others haven't? Or where do these variations come from? And I guess as process practitioners, what should we be thinking of or aware of when looking for these variations that we're trying to standardize? Yeah,
sure. So when I talk about variation, I talk about the variations that come out of processes that are not controlled. So sometimes variation is good. But when it's out of control, or when you don't have control over it, that's when it causes problems. So, the other aspect of control is you don't understand it, or it's ad hoc, or it's not expected. So all those things are out of control. So if we have a process that's in control, the variation is acceptable, and maybe you could talk about tolerance. But really, what I like to say is that if someone's doing something and they don't have control over the process, it's going to lead to uncontrolled variation, which could lead to a poor result. And I think there's a lot of areas where variation comes from. But one of the things that I guess I've found is that variation comes from perhaps the process not being robust enough. So people don't understand the process, people aren't following the process, or the process is not in control. So what happens then is that, when things go wrong, and waste is created, or poor quality is created, and this could be anything from not just in the manufacturing realm, but could also be in the service realm. We're doing something which is not in control, so it's creating a variation. So, I guess sometimes it's hard in generality to talk about where the variation occurs, but I really think fundamentally it comes from a lack of control over the process, or the process is not robust enough. Now, that could be like in the manufacturing space, it could be equipment related. So you mentioned, Daniel, about the age of a business. I don't necessarily think that the age of business naturally correlates to variation. I think it's the maturity of the business that relates to variation. So, for example, a business in a manufacturing sense, a business might put a new piece of equipment in. In these days, it's more likely that there's control and lack of variance, or very minimal variance, or very tight tolerance over the way the machine operates. But years ago, if you don't control the equipment, maybe it's going to lead to variation. But it doesn't necessarily mean, because it's an old piece of equipment, that it actually generates, variation.
Yeah, okay. And I guess depending on the business or the industry, it, I guess, determines how much variation is maybe allowable. I think maybe in certain businesses where maybe life and death are at is at hand, then there needs to be that extra care and attention and control and compliance to make sure that we're doing what we say that we're doing, and we're doing this for the safety of others. Whereas in other businesses, it's more it's not life and death. It's more sort of market share or profit or, things like that. So I'm not sure whether, like from your experience, how you've seen, organizations, embark on that journey of process creation. Coming, for some, it's more about keeping things very controlled and governed, and others where it is more explorative and more, creating that new market. I know some of the big banks that they would have very controlled processes, but they've also got these internal incubators where they're like, hey, let's create an atmosphere, a culture where we can have a team that is creating the future. What does the future look like in this space?
Yeah, look, I totally agree, Daniel. I think it really is a risk-related. There's a risk-related correlation. So it's naturally that you'd understand that variation or poor tolerance is acceptable when the risk is low, but when the risk is high, then you can't accept the tolerance. Industries and businesses mature by understanding the risk and controlling the risk. So a lot of small businesses, I think it's widely known that a lot of startup businesses do fail because of lack of control of process, but it's because they're generating new ideas and they don't have the control over it. The control over the cash flow, that's one of the biggest killers of small business, is not necessarily the idea, because the ideas to go into business are typically very sound. Otherwise, and not always, but typically very sound. So people go into business with a really great idea, but then that idea doesn't carry through and you got cash flow challenges, and then all you need to do is have the market shut down on lending, which happened in the GFC, and then a lot of small businesses can't survive. And that's so. Yeah, I really think that processes really need to be thought through in a business, in a business risk sense. One of the things that I did a little while ago is working for an organisation that wanted to control their business risk. So it wasn't really customer affecting; it was more cost affecting. So the lack of processes or lack of tightening of process or known processes was causing a risk. And typically, a lot of businesses do find this risk. Maybe not so these days, but in the past, businesses find risk with cash. Handling cash.
Right.
So unless you tighten up on the controls of handling cash, cash can go missing, and so not so much, I guess, these days, because these days it's more electronic transfers and, more direct debit or credit card transactions. But, there are a lot of small businesses around that use cash. Unless you have control over those processes, you can find, cash being short
Yeah. Now we'd have quite a number of people listening to this conversation. They're from an organisation where there's a low maturity in terms of process management, but they're listening to this because they want to learn more and they want to educate themselves and I guess take it back to their organisation and adopt business process management as an approach to growing and scaling. And I guess ultimately it all comes down to achieving the strategic objectives of the organization. If it's not tied to that, then what's the point? But what are some of the biggest challenges that the audience will face when adopting a BPM approach? Obviously, there's value there because you wouldn't go through all of the difficulty and the challenge to adopt this approach. But there is a way it can be done well, and there is a way it can not be done well. And then there are all the various challenges that you can't sort of avoid. But what are some of those challenges that an organisation will face when adopting this approach?
Well, that's a very broad question, but I think one of the things is we need organisations need to know the process, and that then generates the task. So the fundamental concept is people doing tasks day in, day out in the business. Some of those tasks can be quite broad. Some of those are very specific. So for example, like in manufacturing, you have a process worker who's working on one particular part of the process, right? Where there could be other people doing multiple tasks, right? So let's just say in a small business, the first thing we need to do is make sure people have an understanding of the process, are trained to the process, and are following the process. So, there's a fair bit in small businesses, the fair bit of autonomy. So people are actually empowered to do the tasks that people are expected to do, but doesn't actually mean that they're actually doing the task. But what we need to do is need to have processes that are mapped out and quite stringent and robust. So people are following the process, then they get an end result. Part of business process management is also is checking the results. So, whether you want to do daily stand-ups or metric boards, dashboards, whatever we do. So we're actually checking the result, but the result comes out of people following the process. So it could be, input into the process is materials, labour, knowledge, all that kind of thing, and people are following the process. So we need to make sure then that we actually checking the result. Right. Now, obviously, that's a lagging measure because the task has already happened. Then we could go and add something like leader standard work, which is more timely and it's checking people following the process. We could have check sheets, we could have documentation where people are actually, checking the in process quality or whatever they're doing. So they're ensuring that they're following the right task. I think the important thing is with having a very strong and robust process is that everybody understands the process. And then if we want to make improvements, right, everyone is on the same page. And I'm very passionate about making sure that it's much easier to improve a process when everyone's following the process than improve a process when you don't know where the process is at, right? So the process drives an outcome. The outcome then we check that outcome to make sure that it's working properly. And if it's not working properly, then we go and do some kind of root cause analysis to find out where the process or investigation to find out where the process has fallen over. So it is the old PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act. The old loop that we're constantly, like Deming's, PDCA loop, that we're constantly checking and amending what we're doing, whether it's a process or whether it's the measurement of the process. I think that's very important. So this is where there's a lot of techniques, there's a lot of tools. I'm a big believer is you to deploy the tool for the need, not use a whole lot of tools when they're not necessarily, I'm not a big advocate of the adjustable spanner, but used in the right way, the adjustable spanner is actually a really good tool.
Right.
But, you wouldn't be using, and I guess some people do, you wouldn't be using the spanner as a hammer. You can't use the spanner as a screwdriver, or you could probably use the spanner as a lever. But at the end of the day, the spanner is designed to do the tool.
Right.
The tool.
Mm. Yeah. So you mentioned quite a number of people there that, bringing people along for the journey. And when it comes to process, it's not just about, I guess, about the people that are involved in the process. And that could be a wide range of people. It can be people that have just joined the organization and maybe have a fresh perspective and are maybe more open to change. And it could also include people that have been with the organization for 15, 20 plus years that have done very similar tasks. And this is going to be uncomfortable changing their habit, changing what's second nature to them. Now, that's one category of people. You've also got the owner of that process, the person who is responsible for the outcome of that process, whether I guess it achieves the results or not. How do you bring everyone along for the journey so that you encounter as minimal roadblocks and resistance as possible, that everyone does buy into it and they see the value in it, and more than that, you're I guess leveraging their expertise and their knowledge and their passion to continue to drive this as well?
I think really good question, Daniel. I think making it simple is the key. So there's a lot of really good tools. So, for example, let's document the process. Let's make it as easy to understand as possible. Then that documentation, whether it's a procedure or whatever, and I'm a big believer on making it more visual. So having a procedure that's more, pictorial rather than wordy. Make it very simple. Make sure people are following it. And then that documentation can be used as a training tool or even an induction tool. This is how you do the process. Have it on the workstation. Maybe early days you need a paper-based system, right? And then eventually it could be digitized, so that people can actually then, press a button on an iPad and the procedure comes up. And then you could even use, rather than having paper to check the process, you could have it digitized as well. But I think really the early days is let's make it simple. Let's have it visual where people can understand where they're at. We deal daily in our lives with visual management. Street signs, traffic lights, very common, but very simple pieces of information. I think we need to focus on the same approach in our work, on our workstations. Let's keep it simple. Let's follow a process. Let's make sure that process is understood. Now, it's a collaborative approach because people learn differently. There's people who, prefer all different styles of learning. So it's not one process that works for everyone. Let's try and make it multi-process. So, you might have some visual tools. You might have somebody doing the hands-on training. You might have somebody who's, you might have a video of something, where people can watch and rewatch too. I mean, I guess that's one of the things that has been so popular on YouTube is if you want to find out how to do something, there's typically a video on YouTube on how to do it. And somebody is actually showing you how to do it. Why? Because people find that easy to learn. And then you could pause the video, rewind it, start it again, try and find out, But that coupled with, maybe a document showing how to do things is very powerful.
Yeah. And I'm sure that you would have seen all of these ingredients work well together to achieve great results for the organizations that you've worked with. Do you have any sort of examples where you can share like real life cases where you've, tackle the process with the goal of improving it in any way, whether it's, optimizing this manual process or converting it to an automated process or something like that, where it has delivered significant sort of value or results. And obviously, censor whatever you wouldn't be allowed to share, but I think that's something the audience would love to hear is what's worked for you, and tell us a story about, where you've seen that work and work really well.
Yeah, I think one of the ones that comes to mind is there's a documentation methodology called picture process mapping. Now, there's quite a few. Even thinking about it, there's quite a few organisations around the world that create software to do this.
Right.
I won't mention them, but there's actually quite a few. So picture process mapping is really a methodology where you combine, like I was saying before, you combine simple pictures with very few words and in almost like very kind of simple instructions. It kind of comes to mind in if you buy some flat pack furniture, for example, like IKEA. But there's quite a lot of examples around. You get a set of instructions. Now, the instructions are very, very basic, right? Very simple. It shows you a picture of what you've got to do, and it gives you probably even one or two dot points to, and because, IKEA is a global organisation, they don't want to have instructions written in multiple languages, so they use pictures. So picture process mapping is a very good tool. One of the things that I learned a number of years ago is that, and there's various degrees of this, right? So one really good case study was an organisation I worked with and had variation. So when a food manufacturing line would start up, and you're manufacturing food and it's being packaged, typically the waste out of the startup has to be managed in a very specific way.
Right.
For example, it's very common, a lot of food organisations won't landfill scrap material because, like a food package that you might buy in the supermarket, you don't want to landfill that because that might that's uncontrolled. So obviously, if someone finds that in landfill and eats it and gets sick, the manufacturer's got no control over it, right? So a lot of organisations would try and then to either depackage that material and throw the package out as landfill, which is just the wrapper, that kind of stuff, or even go to the extent of shredding the material and making, so it's not usable. But one of the things that one of the projects I worked on is in a food line where they were manufacturing food, they were getting a lot of wastage, right? So one of the things we tried to work out, well, let's, this long production line where, there were minimal people. So that over this production line, the production line might have been 30 metres. There were probably 5 or 6 operators, each working as particular part of the line. For example, making sure the material's been filled properly, loading the cartons to be boxed and then taking boxes off the end, that kind of stuff. So one of the things we found that there was, very high variation would start up. So the machine would start up, it'd start running, and until you get to the right tolerance, everything prior to that was waste. So on the line, you do you check the results on how much it takes to start up, which is time as well as material, and then over the volume of the day or the run. Particularly these days, is more food machines do more short runs, quicker changeovers, that kind of thing. But, a number of years ago, it was like people do long runs, which the machine gets to bed down, make sure there's less variation. And then so the proportion of waste on startup is quite small.
Yeah.
But the disadvantage is you've got a long run, and a long run doesn't necessarily work well when it comes to the way that we purchase products these days, particularly shelf life, that kind of stuff. So one of the things that that I think there was either a 15 or 18% waste in startup, which was a cost. So on a small run that is quite sizable. I mean, it's quite sizable in a large run, but in a small run, it's quite sizable, because what has to happen is you have to run, the extra 15, 20% to actually account for that.
Right.
So there's a double-edged sword. It actually restricts you from starting up. It actually restricts you from the length of the run, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we did on this particular line is we tried to determine where's the variation. Try and drive out variation. Try and get the run to start as to get to the right expectation as quick as possible. Right, so start controlling areas of the run. And one of the things that we very simply did was the controls on the machine, which were, gauges to adjust on tolerance and tension and size or whatever. They were like, two dials to the right, one dial back. That's the setting for the day. And then there was a few quite tweaks here and there on startup. So simply we did, okay, well, let's graduate that scale and say, okay, when we do startup, we start up on step number 3. So which was four turns forward, 1 turn back, right? So then the startup procedure is you start on 3, right? To make it easier, we put a blue line on that dial. So in case you couldn't actually see the 3, you lined it up with the blue line.
Right.
There's a methodology on that called center lining. So we just make sure that everything's set up the way it is. So that took the lack of control over that particular aspect. You did that multiple times to multiple areas in the machine. You find that very quickly, within a few weeks, the setup to run the machine dropped from 15% down to 5%.
Right. Wow.
Now, typically I've found that when you do an activity like that, you get a sizable reduction very quickly. Mm-hmm. But it's really the small last few percentages that are difficult, right? Mm-hmm. So you resolve a lot of the problem almost initially, and maybe even initially by investigating it, maybe not doing anything. But you might say, okay, well, hang on, that variation, that's due to that, or maybe the machine needs to be cleaned at the end of the day. Maybe it needs to be lubricated because it's sticking and you can't turn the dial or whatever it might be. So something like that. But I've found that by, looking at each individual controllable aspect of, for example, a machine, then allows you to drive out the variation. And really all that started with, it started a couple of ways. It was a reluctance to continue the way it was going, and some really emphasis on we just got to fix it. How do we fix it? And to focus on it. So, until it becomes a problem or until it becomes noise or a pain point, people aren't working on it, And so that's one of the things, like I was saying before, Daniel, that when you do measure outcomes, is this outcome acceptable? So it could be a macro outcome, for example, die fight. That's a macro outcome. Or it could be a micro output where we're doing something on an hourly basis or something a bit more very specific. But I think the drive comes from when it's not acceptable anymore, and it's either noise, which people can tolerate, or it's a pain point. So it's causing pain. So it's causing frustration. It's causing loss in time. And one of the I think that I find the very important things is you listen to people. Daniel, what's your pain point in this particular process? What's causing you trouble? And okay, well, let's try and fix it. And that's valuable by engaging people. Because people will typically know the pain points, know the frustrations in their task, maybe not necessarily know how to resolve it. And when you've got a leader who's got multiple pain points, it's sometimes the noisy wheel gets, or noisy wheel gets the oil, right?
Right.
But at the expense of other people,
Yes.
So,
right.
So there's no reason why we can't do multiple things at multiple solutions at once to different processes. We may not be able to afford them, if it requires capital investment, but we need to talk to people, find out what's the problems, find out what we can do together. So it's not up to me. I'll empower you to try and test things. If you think it works better turning it four dials forward and 2 back, that's fine. Doesn't make sense to me, but that's fine. And if that works, then let's make that the standard.
Yeah, right. So with so much potential pain in an organization, talking about, talking to different people, everyone's got their different pain points and things that they think could be improved. And you mentioned, which was funny because you pretty much read my mind, is where do you, what gets the attention? You said it's the squeaky wheel. How can we make sure that we're not just, focusing on the squeaky wheel? Because sometimes that could come down to just you've got one person who is maybe very aware and very vocal and very, maybe has an art of communication, and they're the ones that get the, that have more attention on that pain, whereas someone else might be, potentially more introverted, or maybe they're new to the business, so they're not sure how to raise it or bring it to the attention of their manager. But how do we identify, what pain needs our attention, as opposed to just kind of just being tossed and turned where whoever's shouting at us the loudest, so to speak? Yeah,
sure. I think we've got to be more objective and far less subjective. So the way I kind of see it is people who are complaining, creating the noise, those people, that's very subjective, right? Because it's how they feel. It might change from day to day, but it's how they feel. I think it's very important to measure outcomes and be objective about that. So, data-based, it's got to be data-driven. So if somebody's complaining about something, which is fine, I'm not going to say to someone, don't complain about it, right? But we need the data, we need the facts. So we need the data to tell us the story, because what data does is become more objective. It becomes more, and obviously there's things about bias and trustworthy of the data, right? But those aside, if someone has got a complaint and we've got data, then we can actually then be, in some ways, be objective about it, right? So in the scheme of things, what is the most important key drivers that we need to focus on, right? And then there is there data to support that. If there's no data to support that, then we either need to gather data or we need to create a way of gathering data. And typically, for example, pain points, if someone comes to me, like in years ago, someone would come to me as a plant leader and has a complaint about something. It's not working. We're creating a lot of scrap. This is producing quality issues. Okay. Then is it just somebody frustrated and fed up with the process, or actually have data? So what I would typically do is say, okay, let's go and gather the data. How do we do that? Let's go on, whether the data is actually already available, we just got to pull it into a report, or whether we don't have any data and we've just got to control the measurement. So for example, a machine that that doesn't have any electrical controls, for example, okay, so we've got some issues. Let's capture the way the machine is set up, whether it's numbers, whether it's positions, whether it's temperatures, or whatever it is. Let's just record all that, and let's just see where there's a correlation between the problem you've got and the data that you gathered, right? And obviously the data's got to be, integrity of the data is very important. But I think part of also the solution is not dismissing people who are complaining, right? Is listen to people. Now, I don't suggest we react to everything people are saying and go off and do it. we can't necessarily do that all the time. But I think respecting people, listening to them, and giving them some feedback. So if someone would come to me and say, I've got this problem and I'm sick and tired of it, this is a huge issue and no one seems to listen. Hey, I'm listening. I don't know what I can do to fix it, but I'm listening. Now, automatically by listening and being honest about it and showing some authenticity about the way you do things, you've already diffused a lot of the issue, taken a lot of the emotion. Okay, so let's be objective about it. Let's gather some information, and if we can fix it, I will support you to fix it. If we can't fix it, then I'll tell you why we can't fix it. Right? So let's paint the building. Right? That'll fix everything. Well, that's a great idea, but unfortunately, we can't afford to paint the building. Right? But I will make sure as a leader that we actually do target the things that are important, right? But I'm not going to run around trying to do things that we can't justify. So let's get the data. Let's justify what we want to do. Let's see how big the issue really is, and maybe very simply we can shave some of the frustration off it, right? Yeah. And then if it requires some capital investment, then maybe that then gets put into some kind of business case. And then we try and do that in the future. But I think kind of working with people, listening to people, not fueling their frustration, but because it's very easy to fuel frustration. Someone comes to you complaining, totally agree with you. The business is a mess, But, obviously leaders can get caught into that. But, listen to people say, okay, I'm going to help you to help me solve it, and one of the most powerful things is involving people, collaborating with people, empowering people to come up with a solution. Now, it may not be the solution that I thought of, but perhaps the solution would be part of the way there, But, if you're really frustrated with it, go off and try and find a solution. I will support you 100%. Yeah, no, that's good. Well, you've obviously got you're quite active in engaging with people and educating people on this topic. I think it's obvious that it's something that you enjoy doing, and you get a lot of people that are engaged in the content and the videos and the things that you put up around this topic. So what, and I'm assuming that you have people that reach out to you and connect and want you sort of mentor or coach or at least give some advice. What would you say is the most common question people are asking you when it comes to, how do we tackle process? I think the biggest, if I did a survey, or actually I don't need to do a survey, but I think the biggest question is how do I start?
Right.
It's just too much information. Where do I start?
Right.
So the thing that I like to, and I've done this quite a number of times, and the thing that I like to do is say, okay, well, you can't manage what you don't measure. So let's measure it, and let's involve measuring it with a group of people. Don't sit on your computer doing a spreadsheet and no one else knows about it. If you're going to do that, then communicate the spreadsheet, SharePoint the spreadsheet, Google Drive the spreadsheet, print the spreadsheet out, put it on a wall. Let's have a whiteboard and let's fill in that spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's have a conversation about the thing that we're trying to measure, right? And it's pretty simple. Like I've really simplified it, right? But that is so powerful. A lot of organisations either don't measure, or it becomes too academic, too complex. Like I've had conversations with people overseas with my connections with LinkedIn that they've said, it can't be that easy. It can't be that easy. And I said, well, let's just measure something. Agree what you're going to measure and track it. Right? And if it's where you want it to be, then don't focus as much on it. But if it's not where you want it to be, then just do something. We don't know what the answer is. Okay, well then just try something. As long as you're not ruining the business and hurting people, you learn. It's the whole predict, test, verify. It's the whole investigation. I use an example of Sherlock Holmes. If you've ever watched either the old or the new Sherlock Holmes, or the new Sherlock Holmes is very Hollywood, but even anybody like the X-Files, there's the way that people investigate is they don't come in and go, we're going to do this, this, and this, right? They come in and go, well, let's look at the evidence. Let's investigate. Let's try and find out what is the evidence telling us. Oh, we don't have the numbers. Okay, well, then let's get some data, right? Let's start tracking it, right? And that's by far the biggest challenge people have is I've heard about, business process management. I've heard about Lean. I've heard about Six Sigma. I've heard about Lean Six Sigma. I've heard it's fantastic, right? Where do I start?
Yeah.
And then either organisations don't start because they think it's too hard, or they engage consultants, and it becomes very, very academic very quickly.
Right. Okay.
And then it all hinges around, and I know some brilliant business improvement consultants, they're really, really smart people. But the approaches I've always had is I'm going to facilitate and coach you guys to be self-sufficient. It's not going to hinge around me. I mean, I would love to be continually paid to be doing very little, but at the end of the day, the joy that I have is helping somebody on the journey that they could be learning themselves.
Yeah. And I think we see that, I won't say often, but we do see it where, an organisation will get external support to come in whatever form that looks. And when that external support leaves, that initiative dies, or that program or project dies, because it was reliant on these external people that came in, this external support that had all of the IP or the knowledge or the approach or the plan or the initiative. But if that's not really bred across into the organization, if they don't own it themselves, it will fall apart.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think a lot of organizations want to do it the quick way. Because organisations, could be that they could be bleeding. So we want to do it the quick way, or maybe from a financial perspective that we want a sugar hit. We want to do it really quickly.
Right.
Unfortunately, sometimes it's got to take a while to walk the journey, because the key really then is sustainability.
Right. Or the other thing is that it's to past responsibility sometimes, if I can get these people to come and do action my plan, it's not going to be my head on the chopping block, so to speak. But one thing I was interested to know, because obviously we've got a lot of innovative organizations out there that are, paving a way and creating the future, as Michael Roseman talks about. And I think it's very exciting, and I think there's a lot we can learn from other organizations, whether in our own industry or other industries. Are there any, and I probably should have prepped you with this question beforehand, but are there any organizations that come to mind that you're like, wow, that we need to keep an eye on them because they're doing something special and there's something we can all take, learn something from or take away? It could be an organization that you're familiar with, or it could even be an organization that you're not familiar with, but you're like, hey, they look like they're doing some pretty incredible stuff. I want to know more about what they're doing. Who should we be looking at?
Well, I think in the BPM space, I really think that there's a couple of really key players that are small, agile. Sorry, I mean not agile in terms of the agile sense, but in terms of the flexibility. But I think there's a company called Dematic, who they do stuff really well. There's there's a company called Vative that do, innovative stuff really well in the BPM space. I think it really comes down to, listening to people and trying to determine a way to bridge the gap. So maybe not necessarily using a standard tool that you have to spend a lot of energy on to help people to use, but the way that you communicate. So I've put together a lot of animated videos, and some people like them, some people don't, right? But until you've actually got a way of explaining what you're trying to explain, and an animated video can be quite easy, right? And a short couple of minutes video. So I really like that when there's organisations who do stuff that's really really creative, but not necessarily creative for the sake of being creative, but creative and getting a much quicker lead into training. Doing something that's when you first look at it. I worked for an organisation, big food organisation, a number of years ago, and some of the stuff that they were cooking up in terms of lean methodologies was years ahead of anyone else. And because they had a lot of people who didn't really want to just replicate what other organisations were doing, but make it so that it communicated really quickly. So what typically would happen then is they would introduce a tool which in another name would be quite complex.
Right.
And if you had a little bit of familiarity with a tool, for example, like Hoshin Cannery, for example, right? Or the X Matrix. Now, some people have had a little bit of experience with that. You go, oh, my God, we're not going to do that, are we? Right? And then you're on most likely. But if you talk about, well, you know what we're going to do? We're going to do an Excel sheet, which is going to be like a couple of dimensions, top and bottom, and in the middle, we're going to talk about what's our key objectives. And outside that, we're going to talk about what are the inputs into those key objectives. What can we do practically that's going to help that key objective? Oh, yeah, I'm totally understand you, And we're going to do it in Excel, to make it easier, because Excel, you can actually do columns and stuff like that. You can format it rather than doing PowerPoint. Oh, that's pretty easy, right? Oh, and by the way, it's called an X Matrix. Oh, is that what an X Matrix,
Yeah. No, that's great. That's fantastic. Well, Paul, I think we've run out of time, but I've certainly been enjoying this conversation and learning a lot from you, and I know that our audience will have as well. So I just want to thank you for sitting down with me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Daniel. I really appreciate the chat.